What happens when a racist cop abuses his power, only to realize he just handcuffed his new boss? Deputy Rick Tanner ran Oakridge like his own kingdom, pulling over whoever he wanted and making sure men like Nathaniel Brooks never had the upper hand. But when he arrests the wrong man on a baseless charge, his entire world crumbles in just 30 minutes. How did a routine traffic stop turn into the biggest humiliation of his career? And when the truth came out in court, why was the entire town left in shock? Stick around. This is the story of power, revenge, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow, and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the midnight darkness like a blade. Deputy Rick Tanner gripped the wheel of his squad car, jaw clenched, fingers twitching with anticipation. He had been patrolling the outskirts of Oakridge, a small southern town where the past clung to the present like rust on an old truck. And then he saw it. A black man, dressed in a navy suit, standing beside a sleek black Cadillac at the side of the road. Rick's lip curled in disgust. He had spent years in law enforcement, and in his mind, this scene could only mean one thing: trouble. Probably some thug driving a stolen car, he muttered to himself, flicking on his siren as he swerved to the side of the road. The man turned at the sound, eyebrows furrowing. He didn't run, didn't fidget, just watched as Rick stepped out of the squad car, hand hovering over his holster. "Hands where I can see 'em," Rick barked. The man sighed, lifting his hands slowly. "Officer, is there a problem?" Rick's eyes flicked over him. Sharp suit, polished shoes, a briefcase resting on the car's hood. It didn't add up. "Step away from the vehicle," Rick ordered. The man didn't move. "I'd like to know why I'm being stopped." Rick's blood boiled. Defiance. He hated that, especially from men like him. "License and registration," he snapped. The man exhaled through his nose, calm, collected. He reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out his wallet and handing over an ID. Rick snatched it, eyes scanning the name. Nathaniel Brooks. The name itched at the back of his mind, but he ignored it. "This your car?" "Yes," Rick scoffed. "Mighty fancy ride for someone like you." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Someone like me?" Rick ignored him, walking around the car, tapping the hood as if he expected to find something hidden. He ran Nathaniel's ID through the system, but nothing came up. No warrants, no stolen vehicle reports. Still, Rick wasn't satisfied. "You been drinking tonight?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "No." Rick smirked. "Step aside. I'm going to take a look inside the car." Nathaniel straightened. "Not without a warrant." Rick's patience snapped. "Now listen here, boy." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "I'm not your boy." That did it. In one swift motion, Rick grabbed Nathaniel's wrist, yanking it behind his back. "You want to play smart? We'll settle this at the station." Nathaniel didn't resist. He didn't yell. He simply shook his head as Rick shoved him into the back seat of the squad car. 10 minutes later. The station buzzed with low chatter as Rick dragged Nathaniel through the front doors. Other deputies barely looked up. Another black man in cuffs wasn't exactly headline news around here, but they were about to learn just how different this night would be. 8 hours later. The Oakridge County courthouse loomed ahead, its stone columns bathed in the early morning sunlight. The air inside was thick with murmurs as local officials, reporters, and onlookers filled the benches, eager for another routine case. Nathaniel Brooks sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight, his face unreadable. Across the room, Rick Tanner stood near the prosecution, arms crossed, a smug grin barely concealed. He had done his job. Picked up a suspicious black man in a luxury car, dragged him to the station, and now, just like that, the system would handle the rest. What Rick didn't know was that the system had other plans. The judge entered, an older white man with tired eyes. Court is now in session." He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the case file. Defendant, Nathaniel Brooks, brought in on suspicion of... He paused, frowning. Suspicion of what, exactly? The prosecutor, a young, nervous-looking man, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, Deputy Tanner reported that the defendant refused a lawful search and was, uncooperative." The judge exhaled sharply. "And that's why we're here? Because he didn't let you illegally search his car?" Rick stiffened. The judge turned to Nathaniel. "Mr. Brooks, do you have representation?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I don't need one, Your Honor, but I do appreciate the concern." Rick's brow furrowed. Something about Nathaniel's tone sent a ripple of unease through his gut. The judge continued flipping through the file. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His expression changed, eyebrows lifting, mouth tightening. He looked up slowly, locking eyes with Nathaniel. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, would you like to inform the court of your current profession?" Nathaniel finally leaned forward, fingers lacing together. His voice was smooth but firm. "I am the newly appointed sheriff of Oakridge County." The room erupted. Rick's breath caught in his throat. "No," he muttered. "That's not possible." Nathaniel turned his gaze toward him, unreadable. "Actually, it is." The judge tapped his gavel. "Order, order in the court." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Deputy Tanner, were you aware of this?" Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. He felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing down on him. Nathaniel tilted his head. "Or did you not bother to check my credentials before slamming those cuffs on me?" Rick's hands curled into fists. His mind scrambled for an excuse, a way out of this disaster. But there was nothing. Nathaniel sat back, studying him. "I have to say, Deputy, this is quite the introduction." The judge rubbed his temple. "Well, this just became a very different conversation." He sighed. "Mr. Brooks, excuse me. Sheriff Brooks, would you like to proceed with charges against Deputy Tanner?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Rick's entire career hung in the balance. And Nathaniel Brooks? He had all the power now. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. All eyes were on Nathaniel, Sheriff Brooks, as he sat calmly at the defendant's table, now fully in control of the moment. Rick Tanner could feel sweat gathering at his temples. His mouth had gone dry. "Your Honor," Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice measured, steady, "I have no intention of pressing charges against Deputy Tanner." A murmur rippled through the room. Rick felt a flicker of relief until Nathaniel continued. "However," he said, shifting slightly in his chair, "I do believe an internal review of the Oakridge County Sheriff's Department is long overdue." The relief vanished. The judge sighed, closing the case file with a decisive thud. "Given the circumstances, I see no reason for this case to continue. Sheriff Brooks, you are free to go." Nathaniel gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." The gavel came down. Case dismissed. 10 minutes later. Rick stormed out of the courthouse, his mind racing. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in. Nathaniel Brooks was the new sheriff. His boss. It didn't make sense. People like him didn't get those kinds of jobs. Not here, not in Oakridge. Rick had spent years doing whatever the hell he wanted in this town, keeping certain types of people in line. Now, in the span of one night, everything had changed. He needed air. He pushed through the crowd of reporters and spectators, ignoring the questions being thrown his way. Then he heard his voice. "Going somewhere, Deputy?" Rick stopped cold. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the top of the courthouse steps, now. The same things Rick had wielded over men like him for years. Nathaniel descended the steps, hands in his pockets, his movements unhurried. "You seem surprised," Nathaniel said, stopping just a few feet away. Rick's jaw tightened. This some kind of joke? Nathaniel chuckled, but there was no humor in it. No joke, deputy. Just reality. I was appointed sheriff 3 weeks ago by the state commission. I was on my way into town when you decided to arrest me. Rick's pulse pounded in his ears. You should have identified yourself. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Should I have, or should you have done your job properly? Rick had no answer for that. Nathaniel took another step forward, lowering his voice so only Rick could hear. You and I both know why you pulled me over last night. Rick's fingers twitched at his sides. I don't know what you're talking about. Nathaniel studied him, then smirked. Keep telling yourself that. Then he turned to leave. Rick stood frozen in place, his mind spinning. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one calling the shots. And that terrified him. 2 hours later, the Oakridge County Sheriff's Department was buzzing with uneasy energy. Deputies whispered in clusters, heads turning toward the office at the end of the hallway, the sheriff's office. Rick Tanner sat at his desk, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the wood. His gut churned with something he wasn't used to feeling. Uncertainty. The door to the main office swung open, and the room fell silent. Nathaniel Brooks, Sheriff Brooks, strode in. Rick's grip tightened on the edge of his desk as Nathaniel scanned the room, taking in the faces of his new deputies. Some were clearly uncomfortable. Others tried to mask their curiosity. Nathaniel's presence commanded the room. He wasn't here to prove himself. He already belonged. His eyes landed on Rick. Deputy Tanner, my office, now. Rick hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stood, forcing his face into a blank expression. The murmurs of the department followed him as he walked across the room. Nathaniel held the door open, letting Rick step inside before closing it behind him. The office was exactly as the old sheriff had left it. Mahogany desk, dusty bookshelves, a worn leather chair. But something felt different now. This was Nathaniel's space. Nathaniel moved behind the desk and leaned against it, arms crossed. Have a seat. Rick remained standing. I'd rather not. Nathaniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. Of course you wouldn't. A tense silence stretched between them. Nathaniel finally spoke. You've been with this department a long time, haven't you? Rick squared his shoulders. 12 years. Nathaniel nodded. 12 years? That's a lot of time to pick up habits. His gaze was sharp, piercing, like pulling over black men in nice cars and assuming they don't belong. Rick's jaw clenched. I made a call based on suspicion. Nathaniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Suspicion. Right. He let the words settle before leaning forward slightly. Let me make one thing clear, Deputy. Those days are over. Rick scoffed. Meaning? Meaning this department will no longer operate under your old rules. No more harassment, no more profiling, no more unchecked authority. Nathaniel's voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. I will be watching everything that happens here. If I catch even a whisper of misconduct, you're out. No second chances. Rick folded his arms, masking his unease with defiance. So, that's how it is? That's exactly how it is. Nathaniel straightened. You have a choice, Tanner. Either you adapt or you leave. Because one thing is certain. You don't run this town anymore. Rick felt his world shift beneath him. For the first time in 12 years, he wasn't untouchable. And for the first time in his life, he was the one being given an ultimatum. 4 days later. Rick Tanner sat at his usual stool in Murphy's bar, the dimly lit hole in the wall where Oakridge's officers went to unwind. The ice in his whiskey glass clinked as he swirled the drink absent-mindedly, his mind heavy with frustration. Everything had changed overnight. For years he'd moved through this town without fear, without consequence. Now? He felt eyes on him everywhere. Nathaniel Brooks was watching, waiting, And, worst of all, people were talking. "Hell of a week, huh?" Rick didn't have to turn to recognize the voice. Deputy Mike Lawson slid onto the stool next to him, ordering a beer. He was one of the few officers Rick actually tolerated, mainly because Mike knew when to keep his mouth shut. Rick took a slow sip of his drink. "You don't know the half of it." Mike exhaled. "Sheriff Brooks is making moves fast. He's been going through the department's records." Rick's grip tightened on his glass. "What records?" Mike gave him a pointed look. "You know which ones." Rick's stomach twisted. The department had a long history of selective pull. And if Brooks was digging, Rick could feel the walls closing in. Mike lowered his voice. "You think he's looking to clean house?" Rick's jaw tightened. "Wouldn't be surprised." Mike took a sip of his beer, glancing around the bar before leaning in slightly. "Some of the guys aren't too happy about this. You're not the only one feeling the pressure." Rick studied him carefully. "What are you saying?" Mike hesitated, then spoke in a slow, deliberate tone. "I'm saying, maybe it's time we remind Brooks that Oakridge doesn't take kindly to outsiders." Rick's fingers tapped against the bar. He understood exactly what Mike was hinting at. For a long time, Oakridge had been a town that operated by its own rules. Those rules didn't include a black sheriff coming in and dismantling everything. Rick exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. He had two options: bend the knee or fight back. And Rick Tanner wasn't the kind of man who bowed to anyone. He downed the rest of his whiskey and slammed the glass onto the counter. "You let me know who's with us." Mike smirked. "I already have a few names in mind." Rick stood, throwing a few bills on the bar. As he walked out, a plan was already forming in his mind. Nathaniel Brooks thought he had won. But Rick wasn't going down that easy, not without a fight. The Oakridge County Sheriff's Department felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension humming beneath the surface like a brewing storm. Nathaniel Brooks could feel it. He sat behind his desk, flipping through yet another file, one of many he had spent the last few days combing through. What he had found so far was worse than he expected: fabricated reports, unlawful arrests, cases buried so deep they had all but disappeared, and at the center of most of it, Rick Tanner. Nathaniel closed the file and exhaled. He had expected resistance. He knew men like Tanner wouldn't take kindly to a black man sitting in the sheriff's chair, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Deputy Sarah Whitmore peeked her head in. "Sheriff? Got a minute?" Nathaniel nodded. "Come in." Sarah stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. She was one of the few officers in Oakridge who actually wanted change, and Nathaniel trusted her more than most. She hesitated before speaking. "I think you should know. Something's going on." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Go on." Sarah sighed. "Tanner's been meeting with a few of the guys after hours. Lawson, Miller, a couple of others. They've been real quiet at work, but I can tell they're planning something." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but inside he was already piecing it together. "They're pushing back," he murmured. Sarah nodded. "And not just with words." She hesitated. "Someone slashed the tires on your cruiser last night." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. They weren't just whispering in back rooms anymore. They were making moves. Sarah lowered her voice. "Sheriff, I don't know how far they're willing to take this, but I'd watch your back." Nathaniel met her gaze. "I appreciate the warning, Deputy, but I've dealt with men like Tanner my whole life." He stood, adjusting his belt. "If they think intimidation is going to work, they're in for a rude awakening." Sarah gave him a small wary nod before heading for the door. But before she left, she turned back. "Be careful, Brooks. Oakridge ain't like other places." Nathaniel gave her a knowing smile. "I'm counting on that." That night. Nathaniel locked up the department late, his mind still racing. He stepped outside into the cool night air, heading for his personal car, since his cruiser was still out of commission. Then he felt it, a presence. He paused, glancing around the dimly lit parking lot. The streets were quiet, the only sound the distant hum of crickets. But something was off. He wasn't alone. Nathaniel turned his head slightly. "You might as well come out." For a moment there was silence. Then a shadow shifted near the alley, and a familiar voice spoke. "Well now, Sheriff, looks like you and I need to have a little talk." Nathaniel Brooks didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Rick Tanner, who stepped out of the shadows like a snake slithering into the open. Behind him, Mike Lawson and two other deputies stood just out of the light, their postures stiff, their intentions clear. This wasn't a conversation. This was a threat. Nathaniel exhaled, hands resting loosely at his sides. "Took you long enough?" Rick smirked. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" Nathaniel tilted his head. "I'd be disappointed if it didn't." Mike Lawson cracked his knuckles. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you, Brooks." Nathaniel chuckled softly. "See, that's where you're wrong. It concerns me now." Rick's smirk faltered. "Listen to me, boy." Nathaniel's expression darkened instantly. "Say that again." A thick silence hung between them. The old rules of Oakridge had trained men like Tanner to believe they could speak however they wanted, to whoever they wanted. But for the first time, he hesitated. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low, measured. "You don't scare me, Tanner. None of you do." He glanced at the other deputies. "But if you're all standing here, that means you're scared of me." Rick's face twisted with anger. "You think because you wear that badge you're untouchable." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I think because I earned this badge I'm unstoppable." Rick took a step closer, his breath heavy with whiskey. "You're not from here, Brooks. You don't understand how Oakridge works." Nathaniel didn't move. "Oh, I understand perfectly. You and your little boys' club have run this town like a personal playground for years. You pull over whoever you want. You lock up whoever you want. You bury reports. You silence complaints. You control everything." His voice dropped lower. "And now you're realizing you don't anymore." Mike scoffed. "You seriously think you're going to change all that?" Nathaniel's eyes flicked to him. "I don't think. I know." Rick's hands curled into fists, his body trembling with rage. "You're going to regret ever stepping foot in this town." Nathaniel took one final step forward, standing so close Rick could feel the heat of his breath. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air. Rick's eyes darted toward the street, his smug expression finally cracking. Nathaniel smiled. "See, while you were busy threatening me in a dark alley, I was busy installing new security cameras around the department." He gestured up toward the blinking red light on the building's exterior. Rick followed his gaze, realization dawning on his face. Everything had been recorded. Nathaniel stepped back, adjusting his jacket as the patrol cars skidded to a stop, doors flying open. "Deputy Tanner," Nathaniel said smoothly, "you're under investigation for corruption, harassment, and obstruction of justice." Rick's face drained of color. "You can't do this." Nathaniel's smile widened. "Watch me." The old sheriff's reign was over, and the new one. He was just getting started. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Rick Tanner abused his badge thinking he was untouchable. But in the end, the system he thought would protect him became his downfall. This story proves one thing. Karma doesn't forget. No matter how much power someone thinks they have, the truth will always catch up. And when that moment comes, the ones they looked down on might be the ones giving the orders. Treat people with respect, because tables turn faster than you think. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.